Welcome to Worlds Apart. Neutrality is the name of the game both in the United Nations and international law, but in the highly charged geopolitical environment, it often becomes both a weapon and the victim of war. Is it still attainable, or for that matter, even desired? Well, to discuss that, I'm now joined by Dr. William Schabas, a professor of international human rights law and former head of the UN Gaza inquiry. Professor Schabas, it's a great honor to have you on the show. Thank you for this opportunity.
It's my pleasure.
Now, I know that before you became one of the world's leading experts on international criminal law, you also worked as a journalist, so you would know the extent to which many journalists struggle with this concept of neutrality. And I think in this day and age, many journalists believe that it is far more honest to recognize and be transparent about your biases than pretend that you're objective or impartial. I wonder if that concept of neutrality, if neutrality is really attainable for lawyers.
Well, neutrality, maybe that's not the right word. The word is impartiality. I think that when someone is doing a job where they have to judge people on both sides, then they have a requirement to try as much as they can to be impartial. But people have views and they campaign for them. They try to present them depending on the context. So I've often been an advocate for various issues in human rights, and I don't apologize for that. That's my job. I'm not trying to be neutral. I'm trying to present a view. But sometimes I've been called upon to make judgments that are impartial, and so I have to do my best to put those views aside. I think there's a place for both of those.
Okay. Well, one of the reasons why journalists have so many issues with either neutrality or impartiality is because we are the operatives in the court of public opinion, and the techniques for swaying or even manipulating public opinion are well known. You put out some individual stories with a strong emotional appeal, and sometimes those stories come to form their own context, which may or may not correspond to the realities on the ground. I wonder if that aspect, the court of public opinion, influences what you were trying to do, at least in the case of the UN Gaza inquiry.
Well, of course. I mean, the way that we solve this problem in many societies is that we have many voices that speak, from the media and elsewhere. And so people hear expressions of opinions and assessments of the reality from a range of sources, and then they hopefully draw their own conclusion. I mean, there are lines that you can't cross where journalists actually distort the truth quite intentionally to try and provoke reactions and results. And we have, unfortunately, many sad examples of that in history. But when a free press is functioning properly, all of that should work. At the United Nations, it's the same thing when you're dealing with human rights, because you have this background of wanting to campaign to promote human rights. That's the goal. We're trying to establish things. We're trying to win arguments and alert the public to the dangers of violations.
Well, obviously it's a problem, and you just mentioned the concept of free press. Having covered the issues relating to international law for many, many years, I sometimes wonder if free press is just as utopian as the concept of international law, which by its definition is supposed to be impartial and neutral and blind to the parties that are exercising it. But I think in reality, perhaps we don't see that many cases of that, do we?
Well, international law is an interesting phenomenon, because on the one hand, international law was something that originates as a creation of very, very strong countries as a way of controlling the weak, of controlling their colonies, and of protecting their commercial interests. And at the same time, it has become something that's cherished by small and middle states and by individuals and by the people as a way of ensuring that that rules prevail and that they're not subject to arbitrary conduct. So there's an inherent ambiguity in a way about international law. I often tell my students that most of the time with international law, we're not going to court. we're arguing about things. We're arguing on the media, we're arguing in public meetings, we're dealing with political figures, suggesting that one course of action or another is right or wrong based on law. But we're not even in a forum where we're talking to a judge who is presumably impartial and is supposed to try things in a fair manner.
That was my original point, that most of the work that you are doing or we are doing is in the court of public opinion. And I would like to ask you about diplomacy, because when you decided to step down from the chairmanship of the UN Inquiry Commission, the Israeli officials described that resignation as the victory of Israeli diplomacy. And obviously diplomacy these days, not only of Israel, but of many other countries, is highly populist, and I would argue it openly seeks to manipulate public opinion. Do you think they have succeeded in applying diplomacy that way? Have they succeeded in casting doubt on your credibility or the credibility of the inquiry, for that matter?
Yeah, it's an interesting question whether it was a victory or not for Israel when I resigned. I viewed it as it was necessary for me to resign because of they had centered their campaign against the United Nations. Remember, it wasn't really about me. It was against the United Nations for setting up the inquiry. It was against the inquiry as such, which had many other people working for it. But they focused the attack on me, and I decided to step aside in a way to make the target smaller so that the inquiry could get on and do its job, which it did. So, different people will assess it differently. My advisors, the people I was consulting, didn't think that Israel would actually try and fight to get me kicked off the commission. They thought that they would want to keep me there because I would make it easier to attack the commission. So my view is that by leaving, I actually made the target smaller for them, and it was a Pyrrhic victory for them. They may have knocked me out, but they actually provided for the enduring credibility of the commission itself.
But when we look at the sort of language of the Israeli verbal attacks, the language itself was very colorful. The Israeli envoy to the United Nations described you as Dracula, and he said that your appointment was like inviting ISIS to host a religious tolerance week at the United Nations. Foreign Minister of Israel, Mr. Lieberman, compared you to the biblical Cain. This is highly charged rhetorical ammunition, and well, to some extent, at least, it did produce the desired effect. And I wonder, as a lawyer, doesn't it worry you that it takes so little to, if not derail, then at least affect the process of international justice?
Well, they fight very viciously. Lieberman and Ron Proso, the ambassador in New York, and Netanyahu himself, who got personally involved in it. These statements were, I think you described them as colorful. I described them as violent. They were violent images, and they contributed to a very violent atmosphere. We see the results of that in Israel, where we see these lone wolves who go out there and commit terrible, violent acts as part of that context, of that climate. I think it's the job, personally, of politicians in that position to try and calm people down. But that's the game that they've decided to play. In my case, I didn't get any blood spilled on me. I'm fortunate that way. But it does contribute to a terrible, violent atmosphere, which I think is very counterproductive. And I wish they would stop doing it.
Mm-hmm. Now, I want to come back to something that you mentioned earlier, that you believe that despite your critical opinion of Israel, you were able to put it aside and work as a professional and, deliver the impartiality that was required of that mission. But I wonder if impartiality is really required in this day and age, because, if you look at the current geopolitical environment, diplomacy, international law, international media, so much in the eye of the beholder. There's such a convergence among all of them. I wonder, what is really the purpose of impartiality, and most importantly, can it get us anywhere, and can it deliver the international justice that we all want?
Well, again, it depends it depends on the forum and what you're trying to do. But when you have a commission of inquiry, I think it's very important that you should aspire to be totally impartial. That gives the credibility to the results of the inquiry, and I think ultimately it helps to inform public opinion and also to contribute to judicial processes that are underway. One of the features of the Commission of Inquiry on Gaza is that it operated about the middle of its operations in January of 2015. the International Criminal Court became directly involved in the case. And so that's a body that, as a criminal court, also, of course, has to be entirely fair and impartial. And for the work of the Commission of Inquiry to contribute to or to assist the work of the International Criminal Court requires that it be impartial as well. So I wouldn't dismiss impartiality. It has its place, and it's especially important in a body like a Commission of Inquiry. But the proof, by the way, in terms of my own conduct, is nobody's accused me of doing anything while I was chairing that commission that suggested that I wasn't impartial. I believe that that commission operated with great impartiality, and that has contributed to the credibility of its results.
Absolutely, but Professor Schabas, it's not just about that particular report. It's about the functioning of, again, international system at large. And I've heard you say that you would like to see Benjamin Netanyahu, George W. Bush, Tony Blair brought to trial. And let's put aside Netanyahu as an acting head of state, but both Blair and Bush, they retired comfortably. The bloody consequences of their policies are plain for everybody to see. And yet there are very few people, if any, who believe that they will face some sort of legal accountability for their decision-making. So, again, what's the point of maintaining some semblance of impartiality or some semblance of international justice when there's not even a pretense of it in the most flagrant of cases?
You know, the world is changing. Things change in the way we deal with these issues. And I think it was pretty fair to say 15, 20 years ago, even more recently, that the leaders of powerful countries were going to escape justice, whether we talk about Tony Blair, whether we talk about George Bush, whether we talk about the leaders of Russia or of China, of the great powers, not to mention the leaders of Israel, that they would all escape accountability. But that's changing now. You know, the International Criminal Court just a week ago or 2 weeks ago began formally its activities with regard to an investigation concerning Ukraine. The prosecutor is examining the situation in Gaza and in the West Bank. And the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court is also looking at U.S. conduct in Afghanistan, at the conduct of the British in Iraq. And so that's starting. Now, we're at the very beginning. This is just I'm talking the last year or two that this has started to emerge. But it's an inexorable process. It's a process that is part of the, you know, as Martin Luther King, he spoke about the arc of tending towards justice. And that's what's happening in the world. And that means that we shouldn't abandon the impartiality objective when we're talking about these functions, because bringing people to justice means bringing them to impartial justice. If you don't do that, it's no justice at all anyway.
Well, Professor Schabas, we have to take a short break now, but when we come back, rule of law or fundamental flaw? The international justice system is considered broken by many. Can it be reformed or should it be replaced altogether? That's coming up in a moment on Worlds Apart. Stay tuned.
Do we speak your language? Want news, programs and documentaries in Arabic? It's all here on RT. Reporting from the world's hotspots, VIP interviews, intriguing stories. Are you here? Then try RT Arabic. To find out more, visit arabic.rt.com.
Well, the advance of Islamic State on Sinjar forced 500,000 people from the Yazidi minority to flee for their lives. Some were executed, while others, including young girls, were sold into slavery.
كيف رايدك؟ 11
الفي عصري قرني بيستوي كي ارتشت بسري انسان بي ودنيا هم سرا غرجي يغنينا وان خلاص بك جبيك جزي مسرن او سبب مش قاعد ندفع عندن الحل هاد شيء جماعات ما جماعات شان النكارين درباز ببن تغا خطر كيف هم جرى ديش ميدري شو يدري نيجا أجر حبيت شير حبيت نيخش
بلاني كتشان دير زحمة بمش دسي دحش در كمان أمكونا عنيتي
American empire's influence around the world is brought about by indebting countries around the world and then forcing them to pay interest on that debt, backed up by the Pentagon. So it's not an empire of land and material as we've seen in the past empires, like the Roman Empire, but it's a debt of financial engineering.
Welcome back to Worlds Apart. We are discussing the manipulation of international law with Professor William Schabas, former head of the UN Gaza inquiry. Professor Schabas, these days we deal with lots of accusations of international law violations, and part of that is due to this convergence, I think, of, the court of public opinion with national diplomacy. But another part of that is the acceptance that international law could be broken with impunity or at a very low cost. And when you think about that, international law is not some sort of canon of high moral principles. It is the set of rules reached by, well, relatively broad consensus that is supposed to make it easier for countries to deal with one another. Why has it become easier to violate them as opposed to observe them?
Well, I don't think that's the case, that it's become easier to violate international law. You know, it's an imperfect system because it's a system that's in construction. It's rather like law at the domestic level was maybe 1,000 or 2,000 or 3,000 years ago, when it was very, very imperfect and very partial. And, you know, that's kind of the situation that international law is still confronting, because it doesn't have adequate and comprehensive mechanisms to deal with violations. The International Court of Justice, the World Court, is only a court where about a third of the countries in the world have accepted its jurisdiction, and most of the big countries avoid it entirely. And yet, at the same time, our debates about things like intervention in Syria, to take a very topical example, are all being framed with the language of international law. When it's violated, of course, that's a debatable issue, and the way we want ultimately to assess whether it's violated is whether it gets into court. And that's part of our problem. But that, too, is much more robust than it was even 15 or 20 years ago. So you have to have a bit of a vision, and we're in the middle of a process. We're not, there's nothing perfect, and it's ridden with double standards. That's an absolute truth about international law and international justice, the double standards. The question is, do you want to get rid of the double standards by eliminating the standards, or do you want to enhance the double standard problem by getting to a point where more and more everybody's subject to the same justice? That's what I'm working towards. Well,
Professor Schabas, you just said that it's a work in progress, and I wonder if that applies to the Israeli legal stance as well. What I mean is that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, to some extent, still has been serving and still serves as a real-life laboratory for modern warfare. There have been some innovations employed by Israel in the 2014 campaign that could be seen as a way to accommodate earlier criticisms about disproportionality, about the high civilian death toll. I'm talking about these knock-on-roof missiles and early warning SMS messages. And I know that the Commission found them to be inadequate, but isn't it at least an indication that the rules of engagement are shifting, however slightly, that there is a greater care, or at least a greater obligation to care about the civilian lives?
Well, exactly. I mean, this, as I was saying earlier, this whole conversation, this whole debate about conduct by Israel and by the other side, of course, in Israel and Palestine, is being framed in terms of international law. Some of it, we're arguing about, you know, the facts, how the law deals with the facts. And those things ultimately go to courts, and we hear witnesses, and we decide whether we believe them or not. Sometimes we're arguing about the law itself, what it really is. So there are, I think, there's a gray area where we're still quarreling about how much attacks, you know, how much we can tolerate attacks where there is the possibility and the danger of the loss of life of civilians, of non-combatants. And I think Israel tends probably to set that bar rather high, a level of tolerance, and people around the world look at that and say there's something profoundly wrong when 2,000 people, most of them civilians, many of them little children who could not possibly be combatants, are the victims of a conflict when there's so little loss of life on the other side. That's part of the ongoing debate, and that's why we need, the Commission of Inquiry. Look, you've referred to the roof knocking, where Israel comes and they do this, not always systematically, but they drop little bombs on the roof of a building to say that it's going to be attacked, and then they telephone the people inside, and that's well documented, and it's desirable, and that's consistent with international law. The problem is they may not always, though, go and check that the people actually got out of the building in time before they go ahead and attack it. And I think there were examples in the Gaza conflict where whole families were destroyed because they got a warning, and then they had 60 seconds, 90 seconds in the middle of the night to get a family with a lot of little children out of a building, and they just couldn't do it.
Well, essentially what you're arguing is that there is some sort of a civilizing effect, not only on Israel, but perhaps on other countries who are watching this conflict. And I think that feeds into the argument that you often hear in relation to, again, the double standards within the international system or within the international law. Sure, there are double standards, and countries on the UN Security Council and their allies are somehow more insulated from international justice than others. But then, even such an unfair system could have its benefits because it keeps second-tier countries and their leaders in check. Do you subscribe to this type of argument?
Well, yes. I mean, I think we can document the fact that international law even governs and controls and influences the conduct of the most powerful countries. Sometimes they violate it. I mean, we have the notorious example of the Bush administration committing torture in Afghanistan and in Iraq and in Guantanamo Bay. And, Obama, when he took office, one of the first things he did was to acknowledge that. So he said he was going to stop it. The one thing that he hasn't done, and that it is a terrible flaw in the U.S. approach, is that nobody's being brought to justice for it. We have allegations and accusations and judgments at the European Court of Human Rights against the conduct of Russia in Chechnya. And that, too, there are individuals who are responsible for that, and they have to be brought to justice. And no doubt there will be lots of responsibilities, I think, probably on all sides with regard to Syria. But, one of the things is we see the leaders who may not appear to be influenced by the threat of prosecution and by international law. The harder part is to see all the people who are influenced by it, because they don't actually manifest themselves that very visibly. They just don't do things. And this is always a problem with demonstrating that law is having an effect. It's very hard to measure the people who don't do things because they're concerned not just morally about doing things that are unacceptable, but also because they're genuinely concerned that they might eventually be brought to justice. But today, speaking in 2015, I'm confident that there are a lot more people today, including people in the leading ranks of powerful countries, as well as middle and small countries, who are actually thinking today, I might end up in court, and even I might end up in jail. And I like the fact that that's going through their minds.
Absolutely. Professor Schabas, I would like to bring us back to Syria in a second. But if I may ask you before that, we've been talking about bringing those responsible to justice, but obviously there is an alternative course as well. I'm talking about the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. And you were at least on one of them in Sierra Leone. And that's a very complicated process, but I think essentially it boils down to amnesty in return for investigation. And that usually comes at a cost of legal accountability. I mean, there is an investigation, but there is also an understanding that people will not be prosecuted en masse as a result of that investigation. Where could that framework be applied? And is it only fit for the bloodiest of conflicts where retribution in the legal sense of the word takes a second seat to national survival?
The Truth and Reconciliation model or approach has been used in a wide range of contexts, sometimes places where there's just no realistic possibility of actually having a trial or of bringing people to justice, and sometimes where there's a decision that's been taken not to bring people to justice because an amnesty seemed to be necessary in order to get peace, to get the fighters to lay down their arms. So, it's hard to generalize about truth and Reconciliation Commissions when they're used. But I think they're a very constructive contribution. They're not the last word. And in some places, they're clearly inadequate because people have to be held to account in a more genuine sense in terms of criminal trial. But they do fulfill a very useful function. I think it's better to look upon things, there's like a palette of mechanisms that we have, Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, criminal prosecutions, reparations orders, human rights applications to bodies like the European Court of Human Rights, and they all contribute. And there are people in this field who think that one method is preferable to another, or that you should do one thing and not the other. I'm not of that opinion. I think that this whole range of options and alternatives is useful, and you use them also at different times.
Absolutely, but Professor Schabas, if I can interject here, because especially in the case of Syria, the question about whether we are going to demand justice is a highly political one. And, you know, I think the whole conflict in Syria demonstrates not only the divisions within the UN Security Council, but also the attempts on perhaps all sides to use all instruments available to the international system, including, you know, international justice, for trying to sway this conflict one way or another. So I have to ask you, in your personal opinion, do you think the search for justice in the case of Syria could be productive and could help to bring peace about, especially given how many sides, how many members of the UN Security Council are biased on the issue of Syria?
Yeah, well, Syria is a very complex subject. You know, let me take you back to the middle of the Second World War in 1942, where there was a declaration at Moscow saying that the Nazis would be brought to account when the war was over, that they would bring them back and try them. And I think that's a problem with Syria. I think the problem with Syria is that justice is something, and Truth and Reconciliation Commissions and international courts, it's very hard to get anything operational while the war is ongoing. What we need in Syria is peace. That's the first thing, is we have to find a way to get the fighting to stop. And I think we can talk about the justice part afterwards. I wouldn't emphasize that side of it. You know, one of the reasons we have conflict in Syria is because there are all these powerful countries around Syria who are pouring weapons and money and resources into it, fighting a kind of a proxy war, supporting different sides. I wish they'd all get out. I think that we could leave Syria, let Syria get settled down, and it will settle down a lot if all of the contributors to that conflict, who are just escalating it, bringing more misery, would remove themselves from that conflict.
Well, Professor Schabas, you just mentioned the Second World War, and it took roughly 3 years to set up the whole UN system during that war. But the UN has been trying to reform itself for more than 2 decades with, well, rather questionable results. We all complain about how dysfunctional the system is, but I wonder, what is your personal recipe for changing that? Do you think we should start anew, or should we take the system as it is and try to improve it?
You know, there's a famous saying from Winston Churchill when he said that democracy was the worst system except for all the others. And I feel that way about the United Nations. Of course, it has many, many flaws, the United Nations. It has double standards as well, where we have a Security Council that is in effect ruled by the 5 countries who were the victors at the end of the Second World War. It's an anachronism in a way. At the same time, the United Nations, since 1945, has provided us, you, myself, probably almost everybody here watching this, a world without global war, without world war. We've had other conflicts, but the loss of life that we see even in our terrible contemporary conflicts, like Syria, which is probably the worst right now, are minuscule compared with the loss of life that took place during the Second World War and during the First World War. So measured by that scale, the United Nations has been a phenomenal success. And I think, you know, we talk about reforming it. People ask, they say, well, how do we reform the Security Council? And I say, oh, that's very easy. You just have to have another world war. And of course, I'm being facetious. That's not what I desire. But that's the problem with the institution, is that it's living with the power structure that existed at the end of the Second World War. And that's very, very difficult to reform. The human rights part of the UN went through a very important reform about a decade ago, and that has worked. That was a very desirable thing. It's made human rights much more important within the structure of the United Nations. So I'd say the UN, yes, let's keep trying to reform it, but let's not rip it up. It's the best thing that ever happened to the planet.
Absolutely, Professor Schabas, you strike me as a bit of an idealist, and being a realist myself, I think we haven't reached the end of history, both with regards of the human death toll, and with regards to the possibility of the Third World War. But that perhaps is a topic for another conversation. For the time being, we have to leave it there. I really appreciate your being on the show. And to our viewers, please share your thoughts with us on our Twitter, YouTube, and Facebook pages. And I hope to see you again, same place, same time, here on Worlds Apart.